feel free to eat lunch. A number of you have already started that. If you're here for continuing legal education credits, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. But with that, let me introduce our next speaker. We're really lucky to have Shi-Ling Xu here with us from Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he's the director of their environmental law programs. And he's got a fun topic today that we'll talk about: environment, inequality, and capital. I can't imagine there's a better time in history to be tackling that conversation. He's well qualified for that. He's published in a lot of legal journals. He's just published a book, The Case for a Carbon Tax. He was, for a good chunk of time, senior attorney and economist for the Environmental Law Institute in D.C. If you're a student and you haven't heard of the Environmental Law Institute, you should learn about them. It's an amazing source of really good analysis and information about environmental law. He's also practiced law in California as a city attorney in San Francisco, and he's also served at the firm at Fenwick and West in Palo Alto. He's got a bachelor's from Columbia, JD from Columbia also, and a PhD from UC Davis. With that, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, David, and thanks to the Vermont Law School community for having me. It's great to be in such a nice, tightly knit. I love my colleagues in my university, but it's nice to be in a nice, small, closely knit community like you have here. I wanted to offer, while we wait for the AV to come up, a couple of things to say before I get started with my talk. The talk is titled Environment Inequality and Capital. There's not a lot of law in it. It's mostly about economy. But what we forget sometimes is that economies and markets, we think of them as disembodied, self-regulating things. They're not. They're a set of trading rules, and we get to write those trading rules. So we ought to be mindful about how we write those rules, because those markets can do things that we might not expect. The second thing I want to say about this is that it's a little gloomy. It is a sketch of how climate change and income inequality can lead to a catastrophic collapse of civilization. So, we all, what? Yeah, where is he? He would really like something like that. I like talking about death with him too. But anyway, we all kind of think about that. We all kind of worry that climate change is a serious existential crisis. But I think it'd be helpful if we sketched out how that might happen, so we might think about some solutions about how that would happen, how to stop that sort of thing. So I want to make, there we go. Okay, I want to make four assertions. My talk centers around four basic assertions. First, environmental inequality exacerbates economic inequality. By environmental inequality, I mean the environmental justice kind of notion that there's an unequal exposure to environmental risks, pollutions, and toxins. And I'm going to argue that that also extends to access to resources, your ability to acquire food, water, and shelter at different qualities is a form of environmental inequality. And that is actually something that could exacerbate economic inequality. Your exposure to toxins might interfere with your earning power in such a way that it widens gaps between rich and poor. The converse is also true. Economic inequality exacerbates environmental inequality. Think about it this way. The more money you have, what do you spend money on? One of the things that the wealthy do is insulate themselves from environmental risks. So the wider the inequality, the more the propensity to do that. Economic and environmental inequality will spiral out of control together, and this is not going to end well. These two are related in such a way that they feed off each other, is what I worry. And if we can address that spiral, then we might be able to stop it. But we've got to think about both of these in concert. And finally, why can't we solve these problems? Economists believe that inequality is something that is self-correcting in the long run. And they even believe that about environmental inequality. if some people have to put up with toxins, then maybe they're saving money that they can invest in education that gets them up into the upper ranks. But the problem is that there are big coordination problems with that. You've got to get people working together to fix some of the structural problems that cause environmental and economic inequality. So let me take these one at a time and explain what I mean. Environmental inequality exacerbates economic inequality. Well, you know, there's a pretty vibrant public health literature now that talks about the impacts of pollution and exposure to environmental risk on health and therefore on productivity. Most perniciously, you know, if it affects children, then it affects them for a whole lifetime of learning, because everything you learn is cumulative. So if you miss out at ages 4 or 5, then it's a big deal. Just, you know, in my, I grew up in an era where we still had leaded gasoline. So when I talk to my students back at Florida State, I tell them, because of when I grew up and my exposure to leaded gasoline, you know, my cohort is about 1 or 2 IQ points on average lower than yours. A proposition that my students find unsurprising somehow. But that's kind of the thing, right? It doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but on average, this is a big driver of inequality. And then the second part of that I wanted to add was that unequal distribution of scarce natural resources will be more economically significant. So think about it this way. If we have unequal access to resources, in the United States it's not too bad. If you start to look abroad at other continents, then it gets more significant. But if there is a shock to natural resources, the price of natural resources goes up, and what are the wealthy people going to buy? They're going to buy up those natural resources, and it's going to further impoverish those people that can't deal with a resource shock. Okay? Economic inequality exacerbates environmental inequality. Why? Because it better enables the hoarding of resources. So again, if there is a wide gap in economic inequality, if some people have just so much more money to spend, what are they going to spend it on? They're going to spend it on food and water. So I live in Florida, where preparing for hurricanes is a pretty routine thing, especially now over the summer as the hurricane season upon us. It's not a big deal. You go out to the supermarket, you clean out the shelves of bottled water and bread, and it's really not a big deal. You also gas up and get gasoline for your generator. But think about what would happen if we had a longer-term shock, right? If we were looking at a difficulty with getting natural gas or petroleum into a peninsula like Florida for an extended period of time, then this sort of exercise might get a little bit more fraught. And people hoard resources in times of scarcity. If you think about the example of California and how they dealt with the drought, there was very uneven attempts at conservation. This is an aerial photograph of a neighborhood of a San Diego suburb called Rancho Santa Fe. You might have remembered this. It was discussed in the New York Times. On average, they consumed about 80 times as much water as the most thrifty communities in California that were trying to say cut back on water. Why? Because look at those houses, big green lawns, which you shouldn't have in California anyway, much less in times of drought. There's another property in Rancho Santa Fe. I want to kind of also point out that this isn't a foregone conclusion, because this home belongs to the golfer Phil Mickelson, who was in Rancho Santa Fe. But apart from the swimming pool and the putty green, you can see that this is a much more, this property is vegetated with, which is much more appropriately to the climate. This is native vegetation. It goes down a good ways. But you know, you don't have to kind of consume water and resources at the rate that everybody else does. All right, economic and environmental equality, if we don't have enough Phil Mickelsons of the world, will spiral out of control together, and this is not going to end well. This is the part that Pat Parento is going to be sorry he missed. Well, why do I say that? Well, let me kind of use a personal example and then scale up to explain what I think could happen on a larger level. You guys all recognize the guy on the right, even if you're not from New England, no, that's Tom Brady, okay? That was during his Deflategate trial, which is why he's in a suit. So just imagine Tom Brady on the street, and he's approached by a thug. And I made the thug a little bit, a good bit smaller than he is. But the thug approaches Tom Brady, the New England Patriots quarterback, and demands his wallet. Now, if you're Tom Brady, what do? You've been knocked down by bigger guys than that, right? But what do? You give him your wallet. Why? You have a lot of money. Yeah. But you could probably take him. Like, you don't have to surrender your money. Okay, so he could get in a fight. He could win the fight, but if he breaks his knuckles, that is a big deal for a professional quarterback. This isn't just my own fantasy about him, kind of his quarterbacking career in tatters. But you see what this smaller thug has is what we would call a comparative advantage of violence. Even if Tom Brady has an absolute advantage of violence, if he could actually win the fight, the smaller guy might have nothing to lose. And so when there is a big disparity in what you have to lose, which is what happens in situations of economic inequality, then the poorer parties have very little to lose by violence. And both sides seem to understand that. Now, what do you do if you are Tom Brady and you think this might happen? What do you kind of, you might avoid this sort of situation, right? You might fortify. You might get a big property, you might fence it off, and you might try and separate yourself off from this sort of an interaction. But the more you do that, the more separated you are from these people, the more unequal it is, and the further apart parties are driven from each other. So if we think about this writ large, if we think about rich people and poor people, let's just call it the 1% and the 99% for the time being, the richer the rich get, the greater the comparative advantage of violence. And what are the rich people going to do? They're going to compensate that by trying to get an even bigger absolute advantage in violence, trying to reduce that comparative advantage in violence. You're going to have barbed wire, you're going to have electric fences, you're going to do anything to protect yourself from this gulf that you are creating yourself. So, think about this on a broader societal scale. What you're going to do is spend money on security. And we already see people doing that. There are people, the New York Times and the New Yorker was covering this a few months ago. There are Silicon Valley billionaires that are buying property in Idaho in anticipation of the coming, catastrophe, the collapse of civilization, because they want to find a way to make themselves and their families secure from the chaos that they think might happen up around them. What does that do? Once people separate themselves off from society and spend money on security, they're not in the economy anymore, right? Security spending crowds out good economic spending on computers, on books, the stuff that makes economies go around. Spending money on security is a wasted dollar, and moreover, if they start walling themselves off from society, they don't have any stake in maintaining schools, a police force, or the rule of law anymore. That makes the economy weaker. That increases the cost of scarce natural resources, which we might have less of in a climate change future. And if we have scarce natural resources, people hoard those natural resources like they did in Rancho Santa Fe, and the higher cost of natural resources further weakens the economy, right? Think about what a big deal an increase in gasoline prices is. Just think about gas, food, and water. Everything costs more. That is a weaker economy. Now, I drew this up as a list, but really this is kind of a cycle. At any point, you could jump in one of these kind of steps, and it will cycle back to the other steps. So, for example, one of the things you worry about is that the economy has actually been doing pretty well so far, a year and a half into Donald Trump's administration. jobs are getting created. The stock market, in fits and starts, is doing okay, but you always wonder, of course, if something is going to go horribly wrong economically. And if it does, then that could increase the cost of everything: scarce natural resources, gas, food, water. And what's going to happen? People are going to hoard. They're going to hoard the stuff that is now harder to get. Now, you could also think about this as a climate change story, right? I was asked this question: what's different about this? Inequality we've always lived with. Why is this different? One of the things that I think is frightening about climate change is that it can introduce this shock and reduce the availability of natural resources for an extended period of time, like in Florida, such that it starts to make people fearful. And even if you were kind of civic-minded, if you're looking at a long-term shortage of natural resources, I think your fear is going to make you want to hoard those resources if you can. And you can only do that if you've got the money to do that. So, anyway, that's kind of my sketching out of how this is all going to hell. But how do we solve this? Well, it's hard. This is something I call a true tragedy of the commons, not what I call a large group externality. I think we might have this notion that oil companies or coal barons are benefiting and the rest of us are suffering for it. That's not quite right. I think everybody is worse off, and I think a number of oil companies and coal barons actually recognize that the world is going to be worse off just because of the broad societal implications of climate change, of income inequality, and we would do something about it if we could, but it's harder to do that. Now, let me illustrate that by showing you the 10 largest oil companies in the world by revenue. This is the 10th largest. It's Lukoil. It's the Russian state-owned enterprise. Next up is Total, the French oil giant, energy giant. BP. This is the Kuwait Petroleum Company, the state-owned company of Kuwait. Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, and now we get into the three Chinese giants, the PetroChina of Company Limited, CNP, Chinese National Petroleum Company, and Sinopec. The three of those together are a behemoth of oil interests, and then the largest in the world, Saudi Aramco. These 10 oil companies represent about 70% of all global oil revenues. And this is what's tough about solving the climate change problem and about environmental and economic inequality is one of these companies, or two of them, or three of them, might want to solve this problem. But what happens if they do? We've heard BP, Shell, and, well, that may be, Total has also expressed concern over climate change. But what happens if they try and do it alone or without sufficient buy-in from the rest? It all falls apart, right? You've got to get all of these companies on board, or almost all of them, to make it work. That's why it's hard to solve the problem. And we've seen that before because we know that negotiations, international negotiations for a climate treaty are fraught because you got to get 192 nations to agree on something. It actually seems miraculous to me that Paris was as substantial as it was. It's hard to do. Now, I guess at this point, we are left with some questions still. How did inequality get so extreme, right? We've believed for a long time that, you think about economic inequality. If some of you get poor enough, you become what economists call a cheap factor of production. But that means you're going to get hired, right? That means that money's going to flow from rich to poor just because it's in everyone's self-interest to make this bargain where if you're inexpensive enough, you get hired on. But why has it gotten so much out of control? There's another way of saying this, is why aren't the negative feedbacks a little bit more effective in reversing inequality? Why haven't there been political ramifications to income inequality? Well, there sort of have, but not quite yet. And then why is climate change so hard to solve? Apart from the coordination problem, I'm going to offer another explanation of why climate change is hard. And it has to do with capital. That was the third part of my kind of three-word title, is capital. It's been 150 years now, by the way, since Karl Marx wrote this book, Das Kapital, The Critique of Political Economy. And his view is that capital is the end of kind of organized economies, because what it does is kind of, it's, you know, some of you studied this in college, it kind of separates workers from their labor. When capitalists own the means of production, they have kind of a monopoly over, it's actually a monopsony over kind of how things get done, and as a worker, you're at their mercy. And eventually, the two sides get further apart, and the working class is going to rise up in a violent kind of overthrow of the capitalist class. You know, there's another Karl that was a little bit more on the mark. This is an Austrian economist named Karl Polanyi. He wrote in the 1940s something that was really prescient about capital, and it's that capital has a way of overwhelming democracies. What capital does is stuff that democracies could never get away with, governments could never get away with doing. So if you think about capital has kind of flipped large kind of portions of this country out of work. It has imposed austerity measures on countries that otherwise would try and reinforce some of their public institutions. We see that happening in the European Union. And it's all because what happened around the 1970s, what Karl Polanyi kind of forecast, was that capital started developing a life of its own. That people, capitalists, would invest in the companies that had the best balance sheets, but not necessarily the best schools, the best institutions, the best arts. Capital has a way of flowing to countries that compete to have the lowest common denominator. All right? Now, fast forward a little bit more. 3 years ago, you might have remembered this book exploded onto the scene. Thomas Piketty is an economist. He started teaching at MIT when he was 22 years old, and he wrote this 778-page data-heavy book, which just flew off the shelves. I couldn't get my copy for 3 weeks. Now, who thought like a 778-page with so much data was going to sell so well? But he touched on a nerve, right? We are really concerned about economic inequality. Now, all three of these were critical of what I think we would call the liberal world order, where countries trade amongst each other, where capital flows from one country to the other. We have this notion that capital is supposed to do that. Rich countries are supposed to export capital to poor countries so that they can develop. All three of these offer a vision that says maybe it doesn't work that way and maybe it doesn't work so well. All three of these missed the huge connection to law. This is why I kind of wanted to do this project, is we think of capital, markets, economies as these self-sustained, disembodied things. They're not. They're sets of trading rules that we get to write. We get to write the rules about capital, but I don't think we're very conscious that we're doing that when we do that. All three of these predicted trouble. Marx predicted the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Karl Polanyi was a little bit more optimistic, but saw that capital doing things to people that democratic countries couldn't was going to be trouble. And Thomas Piketty as well was kind of concerned. He called this increasing wealth gap terrifying. All three of these probably foresaw the rise of authoritarianism as a response to capital running wild and doing things that elected governments could never get away with doing. So, you know, we've come around full circle then. It's kind of hard to connect Marx with Trump, isn't it? This is not an LSAT question where, you know, which one of these does not belong. Because in a way, it's kind of funny. All three of these kind of saw populism and authoritarianism coming up together. We don't think of those things together, but that's really what happened with capital. So how can we deal with this? I think redistributive mechanisms, Now, certainly kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is going to be important to stopping climate change, but things like the minimum wage, redistribution programs, they help, but they don't address the core problem of why inequality happens and why it persists. We've got to deal with the fact that capital has its own life, and that is actually the driver. It's not actually people. It's capital that has its own political economy that is causing inequality to be so extreme, is countering the negative feedbacks that we normally expect to have happen, and making climate change so hard to solve. So what could we do about capital? We could stop privileging physical capital. I could start with all of the different tax deductions that are available to owners of capital. You know, there's something called bonus depreciation. If you're any small business, you get $500,000 of kind of a one-time write-off. You could buy computers, desks, cars. They used to call it the Hummer exemption before Hummers went out of business. But you know, we encourage people to buy stuff. We encourage them to buy physical capital because we think capital, labor, they're complements. If you buy more stuff, you'll put more people to work. That is the narrative that's been driving public policy for such a long time. Once we have the physical capital, moreover, and there are a lot of other things. Beyond tax provisions, there are lots of ways which we say, oh, you're buying stuff, good on you, let's help you do it. And once that is acquired, we protect that capital. What we could do is grandfather this capital less. We have coal-fired power plants that are out there that have been running for 70, 80 years. We let them keep running because they have them, because we've grandfathered them into an old regulatory scheme, and we're somehow reluctant to kind of not respect people's expectations, interests, right? Professor Echeverria has written about regulatory's takings jurisprudence, but you know, where does that come from? Why are we so reluctant to regulate property? It's because somehow we have some respect for people's investment in capital. We encourage them to get it, and once they get it, we protect it vigorously. This might seem kind of funny to say in an environmental / economic talk, but there's another kind of capital out there that we could encourage. Economists call it human capital. It's just education. It's not necessarily formal education, but it is a form of capital. What you know generates a stream of income for you, hopefully. And this capital is actually much more productive. If you think about what makes the American economy valuable, the knowledge, pretty conservative economists have estimated that the value of human capital is about 10 times that of the physical capital. So take all the Hummers, the coal-fired power plants, the desks, the buildings, the computers, everything out there, multiply that by 10, and that's the contribution that human knowledge actually makes to the functioning of our economy. Why do I kind of put that in a story about inequality and climate change? It's because part of why climate change has been so hard to solve is because we got these hard fixed assets that are in the way. If that was capital in the form of knowledge, you could imagine that's a lot less of a big deal, right? If you're an engineer, if you learn basic engineering principles, you know how to operate and build drill rigs. Losing the drill rigs is a flat $3 billion loss. But as an engineer, you could take the knowledge that you learned about operating a drill rig or building it and transport it to something else entirely. It's less sticky, if you will. And if we could kind of build economies on human capital rather than physical capital, we might be all better off. Okay? And then finally, this is something I never thought I would ever say, is we should actually subsidize some climate technologies. We should subsidize things like direct air capture, things to get us out of this trap of kind of perpetuating fossil fuel kind of consumption because of the capital we have to do that. Because think about it this way, we have been figuring out how to dig fossil fuels out of the ground, transport it, and burn it for 100 years. The fossil fuel companies have a 100-year head start on solar, wind, hydrokinetic, all of the renewable sources of energy, all of the low footprint technologies like composting toilets and all the other little things we could do to reduce our footprint. We have to kind of address this head start that the fossil fuel companies have in technology. So I might not ordinarily have said that because, you know, as an economist, you always want to tax bad things because it's easier to figure out what's bad. It's a little bit harder to figure out what's good. And so if we subsidize climate technologies, there's a risk that it's not quite as good as we thought it was, like we thought coal was, you know, some time ago. So this is a recommendation I undertake with some reluctance, but because of what is at stake, because of how quickly and how forcefully we have to reverse these trends towards economic and environmental inequality, I think it's time that we put a little bit of funding behind that. So anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Shi-Ling. So we've got time for conversation and questions, and I know there's going to be some good ones. Yeah, Professor Scanlon. Yes, please. Thank you. We're live streaming.
Thanks for the talk. On your last slide, just to clarify, when you say fund climate technologies, are you categorizing that as a form of capital?
Yeah, it is. So that's a great question because we could fall in the same trap. We could fund these climate technologies, wind turbines, solar kind of technologies, and that is capital, isn't it? But, you know, I guess the reason I've come around to this is because in our modern economy and our world order, it just takes big things for something like a transformation of our kind of energy grid to happen. We have to have certain kinds of capital to compete with the existing behemoths of capital stock that are out there. So yes, it is capital. And it's physical capital too in some ways, although it's probably less physically intensive than the way we've been doing kind of energy production in the past. But is that capital? Is that kind of why you're asking?
I was just curious how you were thinking about it. And then so the fund human capital and fund climate technology capital, those would both be government investments.
Yes, they would.
So I'm curious how you think about GDP and the role of GDP in perpetuating inequality and environmental harms, and if that needs to be addressed, or if you think this fits perfectly into using GDP as an indicator of well-being.
Well, GDP is not perfect, but let's just forget about GDP for the time being. Let's just agree that we could kind of somehow imagine and recognize good economic activity when we see it. And the reason is this would fit in because, you know, remember kind of human capital does so much more to further economic growth than physical capital does. So funding human capital kind of spurs economic growth more than privileging the physical. We could take, here I'll take kind of a specific example that maybe sharpens this. If you are kind of, if you want to get an LLM in law, if you are a practicing lawyer and you just want to refine your skills, that is deductible, right? If you were, I don't know, doing something else, if you were a corporate lawyer and you wanted to get an LLM in environmental law, that is not a deductible expense. Why? Because we seem to want you to build upon the capital you already have as whatever kind of a lawyer you were and make that bigger because we think that's proven and productive. But we don't like you changing streams and expanding your horizons because that somehow the tax code thinks is consumption or indulgent or something not as productive. I think the opposite is true, which is why I make a point of talking about human capital in an environmental talk, is that the whole reason we have to fund human capital is because we haven't been imaginative enough with kind of new technologies, with climate policies, with all kinds of things. So I would say it does fit in with a new model of growth. It just doesn't have to revolve around stuff.
Here, and then we'll get it to John.
So obviously, our economy that we're living in today, as capitalism revolves around the idea of capital and material goods. So what effect do you think, if we were to switch to another form of economy like socialism, would change with inequality or the environment?
Well, I'm not proposing we go that far. But I brought up Karl Marx and all these kind of socialists, not because we should have socialism, but they identified capital as the problem. I think for too long we've been thinking interest groups, oil industries, fossil fuel companies, they're the problem. They're not really the problem. The problem is what they have is taken on a life of its own. You got $700 billion worth of coal-fired power plants out there. If you want to switch them off, that's a big deal. It's not even the fact that oil companies or electric utilities want this. It's the fact they got this capital on their books and they are duty-bound as kind of trustees of their shareholder kind of assets to protect them. Right? So that's why I kind of center this talk so much around capital. It's also what drives us apart. Once you got the capital that's made you rich, you're just not going to give that up. Now, do we have to go to socialism for that? That might be a bridge too far for me. But we do have to recognize how we are encouraging people to invest in capital and how they do it and how that is kind of driving people apart.
Thank you for that interesting talk. I'm curious how you see ongoing investments in land conservation in your framework. I was trying to figure it out on the internet and I couldn't really, but 2 or 3% of the Vermont budget goes to fund the so-called current use program, which pays owners of forest land and ag land, most of whom are out-of-staters, to not develop their lands. You know, the conservation easements taken by taxpayers consume a couple of $1 billion a year. The Farm Bill has billions of dollars for conservation programs. You know, if you add it all up, we're talking, you know, not a lot of money, but billions of dollars. And is that a good use of money? Is that you know, in a big picture way, is that a good use of money? How does that affect wealth distribution? Do you have any observations about that? Effectiveness, usefulness?
Yeah.
Priority of those expenditures?
And I want to know about who gets that in terms of economic inequality. I don't typically think, I guess it could affect economic inequality if we're really just subsidizing the people that already have it. If you're talking about Vermont, the program within Vermont, I have trouble imagining that that's contributing a lot to income inequality, right? Do you have that sense? So, I mean, that's not a bad thing, economic inequality-wise. I do think it's good if you're paying someone to not commit their land to something that would be hard to undo. So keep it in agriculture, keep it in forestry. Don't pave it over and put a strip mall on it and create this capital that would make the owner of that land desperate to preserve it. If it floods out, it washes out in a hurricane, and make that owner desperate to rebuild it. If it's an ag and forest and it washes out, that's an entirely different proposition. So insofar as it is paying people to not invest in capital, which sounds kind of weird, I'd say it's probably a good thing. And the other part of that too, the other reason why it's good is that we are you might say we're investing in natural capital. That's a category I don't go into a lot because I don't know what that is and how to define it. But we are, right? We're investing in clean water and the infrastructure for clean water and resources. And that's a valuable thing, even if we don't price it in our kind of economy.
Thanks very much for your talk. And John, as an in-stater current use homeowner, I like to think that I'm contributing to some level of ecosystem services, as well as the local economy for the folks who hunt on my land.
Oh, okay,
So,
yeah.
but I'd like to take us out of the country and to your comments about the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, I'm thinking through your ideas and how they could play into the current negotiations around Article 6, the new market mechanism that will take the place of the Kyoto Protocol's flexibility mechanisms. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, I guess my kind of the core theme is we make the rules for markets, right? We got to write those rules. We got to write them carefully. One thing that we haven't really seen with environmental markets is people getting rich. They may visit environmental harms. They might actually, I guess there are some concerns that once you have markets, it might kind of impose some risks upon communities in the environmental justice way of imposing upon communities that could least defend themselves. So I think that would be one concern. The thing about it with climate technologies, if we could separate that out from some of the other pollutants that coal-fired power plants do, is that we don't have the same kinds of environmental justice concerns with markets for carbon dioxide. So the only concerns I have with markets are we've had that kind of unfortunate experience with markets where we kind of paid Chinese entrepreneurs to build refrigerant plants solely for the purpose of generating credits when, you know, they weren't actually kind of reducing emissions of anything. The only reason for refrigerant plants went up is to generate credits to allow German or French polluters to not reduce their emissions so much. So that's a market that wasn't very kind of well drafted. But I guess, you know, we have so little experience with markets for environmental goods and bads that it's hard to say. For me, I kind of fall back on taxation as a less harmful way, generally. Thinking about all of the ways that things could go wrong when you draw up these markets, taxes are an easier way to kind of change the rules of a market. But I think probably subsequent negotiations are going to get into creating markets for permits. Is that right? Yeah. Well, I don't know. Who knows? That would certainly be better than nothing. And kind of even if you take all the bad things that happen with markets in the climate change context, it's still going to be better than not having a market at all.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can talk for just a minute about jobs and how, you know, in our economy, jobs are the dominant mechanism for distributing capital. And so on the right, you have talk about revitalization of the traditional industries, and on the left, maybe some more talk about green industry. So with funding human capital, how does that interact with job creation and finding ways to distribute wealth under the traditional mechanism?
Well, you know, part of why we have a lot of people in the United States, even as job losses have piled. I mean, jobs have come back. Jobs have come back under Donald Trump, but not in the ways that we would have kind of wanted them to. We have a gap in what people know how to do and the jobs that are out there for them to do it. So that's one answer is we've just got to find a way to train people to keep up with technological changes. So that's part of it in terms of job creation. The other part of it, the more subtle part, is the macroeconomic part is once these people can actually hold down the jobs that require some training, that are advanced, that they haven't been trained for, they have money. They have money and they spend it. They go to a store and buy stuff, and that creates jobs, right? There's something that economists call a multiplier effect. If you pump $1 into the economy of South Royalton, Vermont, that circles around a couple of times. If you go to the massage therapist and spend $1, they'll go into the South Royalton Co-op and spend 90 cents of that dollar, sock away 10 cents. The South Royalton Co-op, they're going to take that 90 cents and go to dinner at the Five Old Tavern. It goes around and around and around. So what we do know is that human capital creates spending that cycles around a lot more than when we spend money on bodyguards and barbed wire and security and even kind of stuff, the physical capital that has formed the underpinning of kind of our kind of energy economy. Now, I want to say one thing: low energy prices are a good thing, and abundant oil and gas have created low energy prices, which has contributed to growth a lot in our economy. It's just that we could actually do that with different technologies and still have low energy prices, low-ish energy prices, and not have these other pathologies that we've created.
Thanks, Shi-Ling. I think a lot of what you talk, I think appeals to me inherently based on my own interests and values. I guess I have one observation and one question, really. One is, I think based on where you ended up, it seems that the tragedy of the commons is really not as you're not really as pessimistic as you started out, given that there are solutions here. And maybe all I want to point out here is also, this is maybe more in line with what Tracy just sort of referred to. I think the Paris Agreement is a great advance, but in my own view, actually, it's good for reasons different from what it usually is lauded for. And people, I think, have been really taking the wrong lessons about the process of climate change negotiation, especially based on where the current climate change set of treaties come from and the lessons of the Montreal Protocol that preceded and which the climate change treaties have been modeled on. But the question that I have for you really is, so there's a big 800-pound gorilla that I thought you were going to get to that you actually didn't raise, which is intellectual property. Intellectual property both as capital and as the huge wealth generator in Silicon Valley, where I now teach. And really that has been, I think in some ways, is driving so much of international trade and the relationship between some of the countries. I'm wondering how you think this fits in, or your thoughts on that.
Well, let me deflect that one for a minute. Well, let me ask you one thing about Paris. When you say we learned the wrong things, are you saying that we really ought to take heart in the fact that we did agree on something in 2015 in Paris? Is that what you're saying?
No, the simple thing is, I think maybe two just quick responses. One is, I think what you see in Paris is actually another, what people haven't really talked about is that this is really an iteration of where we were in 1992, actually. The approach of voluntary targets, but at the same time, Paris is not the same as the 1992 Framework Agreement. We're in a very different place. The lesson, I think, is much more based on the nature of the tragedy of the commons, and that the different types of collective action problems. Right? You're familiar with Elinor Ostrom and the approaches, and including what in poli-sci theory has been referred to, as an alternative approach to it, the bandwagon theories, and what David Victor has talked about, sort of the clubs. This is something that I've sort of thought about a lot. And that is in some ways what you sort of see playing out now, as opposed to sort of this broad 197 country United Nations Assembly style legislation approach. I think that is actually not what is really making these efforts work. So that's really
but you know what? So intellectual property actually gives me an opportunity to say something about international cooperation in climate technologies. There is something called the International Food Policy Research Institute. it's mostly funded by the United States and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but different countries do contribute, and this is why it has actually been a pretty successful research model, is that countries send their agronomists to one of 15 or 16 research centers throughout the world to develop new technologies and techniques in, in rice growing, in kind of pest control, low pesticide pest control, all kinds of things that is useful knowledge. And what is great about IFPRI is that everybody puts into it and everybody gets much more out of it than they put into it because it's open domain knowledge. It's countries getting together and when scientists from different countries get together, go work together on growing rice, they learn something from each other. They take that added knowledge and go back to their countries. This is what I think climate technology should look like. So no intellectual property, but this would actually be a plausible treaty, wouldn't it? Everyone we kind of fund at a fairly modest level. It doesn't take that much money to get a couple of teaching buyouts and research grants and travel grants to set up 15 or 20 of these climate technology centers. Have a center devoted to direct air capture, another center devoted to carbon sequestration coming out of fossil fuel plants. All these kind of things we could work on. We could do that, but this research you must kind of appreciate is pretty robust. The more open the research is, the greater the positive feedbacks, right?
The network externalities,
network
right, that they talk about in
right?
IP, yeah.
People learn more when that knowledge is more easily available. And I think that's going to be an important lesson going. So if we're going to patent, carbon capture technologies, that's not the way to go. Fortunately, that probably isn't going to be a useful technology anyway. But thanks for that question, because that's a point I would have liked to have made. So.
Very positive note to end on. Thank you so much, Shi-Ling.
Thanks.